My name is Saren Blackwood, and I'm 28 years old. Last Tuesday, I discovered that the generous gift my parents gave me, our family home, came with a hidden price tag of $154,000 in toxic mold remediation debt they'd been hiding for 3 years. What I thought was their way of helping me start my life after my divorce turned out to be the most calculated betrayal I'd ever experienced. The worst part, they'd been planning this financial trap since before my marriage even fell apart, using my vulnerability as their perfect cover. This isn't just about money, it's about how blood loyalty became a weapon, and how a family dinner revelation would expose decades of lies that would ultimately destroy everything I thought I knew about the people who raised me. Hey everyone! Before we dive into this absolute nightmare of family betrayal, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I love connecting with you all, and if you're ready for a story that'll make you question everything you think you know about family loyalty, smash that like button and hit subscribe, because this gets so much darker than you think. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this revenge story unfolds. The gift happened on a seemingly perfect autumn evening 6 months ago. I was still reeling from my divorce from Marcus, a controlling narcissist who drained my savings and left me questioning my worth. My parents, Richard and Janet Blackwood, had always been my safety net, or so I believed. They owned a beautiful Victorian home in Portland's Hawthorne district, worth easily $400,000, where I'd grown up feeling loved and secure. "Saren, honey," my mother said over her famous lasagna, her voice dripping with what I now recognize as manufactured sweetness. "Your father and I have been talking, and we want to do something special for you during this difficult time." She exchanged a meaningful glance with my dad, who nodded sagely. "We're getting older, and this house is becoming too much for us to maintain. We've decided to transfer ownership to you." I nearly choked on my wine. "What, Mom, that's incredibly generous, but I can't accept something so valuable. This house is your retirement security." My father leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together in what seemed like genuine emotion. "Sweetheart, you're our only daughter. We've watched you struggle since the divorce, and we want to give you stability. Besides, we're moving to that retirement community in Arizona anyway. The house would just sit empty." The paperwork appeared with suspicious efficiency the next week. Looking back, I should have questioned why everything moved so fast, why they didn't want me to have an independent inspection, why they insisted on handling all the legal details through their longtime family attorney. But I was drowning in grief and gratitude, overwhelmed by what seemed like an incredible act of parental love. The transfer happened seamlessly. One day I was living in a cramped studio apartment, the next I was the proud owner of my childhood home. My parents had already moved to Arizona, calling regularly to check how I was settling in. Everything seemed perfect for exactly 3 blissful months. Then the smell started. It began as a faint mustiness in the basement, something I initially attributed to Portland's notorious dampness. But it grew stronger, accompanied by mysterious water stains appearing on walls that had seemed pristine. My energy levels plummeted. I developed a persistent cough and constant headaches. When my friend Maya, a nurse practitioner, visited and immediately commented on the sick building smell, I finally called for professional help. The mold inspector arrived on a crisp February morning. James Chen was thorough, methodical, and increasingly grim as he worked through the house with his testing equipment. After 4 hours, he sat me down at my kitchen table with results that made my blood run cold. "Miss Blackwood, I'm required to tell you that this house has extensive black mold contamination throughout the structure. The damage is severe and long-standing. I'd estimate it's been developing for at least 3 to 4 years. The moisture intrusion points suggest multiple roof leaks and plumbing issues that were never properly addressed." My hands trembled as I reviewed his detailed report. The contamination was everywhere, behind walls in the HVAC system, throughout the basement, even in areas that would have been clearly visible during regular maintenance. This wasn't something that developed overnight. "What does remediation typically cost for this level of damage?" I asked, though my stomach already knew the answer wouldn't be good. James winced sympathetically. "Given the extent of contamination and the age of this house, you're looking at complete remediation, structural repairs, and full replacement of affected materials." I'd estimate between $120,000 and $180,000, depending on what we find once we start opening walls. That night I called my parents for the first time since the inspection, my voice shaking with disbelief. "Mom, Dad, I need to ask you something directly. Did you know about mold problems in the house before you transferred it to me?" The pause was too long. Too telling. "Mold, honey, what are you talking about?" My mother's voice had lost its usual warmth, replaced by something sharp and defensive. "We never had any mold issues. Maybe it's something that developed after we left, but I'd already done the math. The inspector's timeline didn't lie. This contamination had been growing for years while they still lived there. They had to have known." The lies unraveled quickly once I started pulling threads. Armed with James's report and a growing suspicion, I drove to my parents' old neighbors, the Hendersons, who'd lived next door for 20 years. What Margaret Henderson told me over coffee changed everything. "Oh honey, your parents had contractors at that house constantly. The last few years," she said, her weathered face creased with concern. "There were multiple roof repairs, plumbing companies, and I remember your mother mentioning something about water damage in the basement. Richard was quite stressed about it. I saw him arguing with insurance adjusters more than once." Insurance adjusters. My blood chilled as the implications hit me. "Mrs. Henderson, do you remember roughly when this was happening?" "Started about 4 years ago, I'd say. Got really intense the year before they moved. Your mother seemed quite upset about the whole situation, always talking about how expensive everything was getting. 4 years ago. Exactly when the inspector estimated the mold contamination began. I spent the next week conducting what I privately called my investigation. I pulled public records, contacted the previous insurance company, and even reached out to contractors who'd worked on the house. The picture that emerged was devastating in its calculated cruelty. My parents hadn't just known about the mold, they'd been battling it for years. Insurance claims showed multiple water damage incidents, each one denied due to lack of proper maintenance or pre-existing conditions. They'd spent thousands trying to address symptoms while ignoring the root cause, creating a perfect storm of contamination that would require complete remediation. The most damning evidence came from a contractor named Luis Morales, who'd worked on their basement in 2021. "Your parents knew they had a serious mold problem," he told me over the phone. "I recommended full remediation, gave them a quote for about $130,000. Your father said they couldn't afford it, and asked me to just patch the visible areas for selling purposes." For selling purposes. They'd known the house was a toxic liability, and had actively concealed it to pass that burden to me. But the deepest cut came when I found the real estate consultation emails on my father's old computer, which I still had access to, from when I'd helped them with tech support. The correspondence with a realtor from 2 years ago was brutally honest. "Given the extensive mold issues and required remediation costs, the property value is essentially negative. We recommend either complete remediation before listing, or finding an alternative disposal method." Alternative disposal method. That's what I was to them. A disposal method for their financial toxic waste. The betrayal cut deeper than Marcus's worst manipulations ever had. My ex-husband had been cruel, but at least he'd been honest about his selfishness. My parents had wrapped their exploitation in love, used my vulnerability as leverage, and condemned me to years of debt while positioning themselves as generous benefactors. That night, sitting in my contaminated house wearing a respirator mask James had insisted I use, I made a decision that would define the next phase of my life. I wasn't going to be their victim. If they wanted to play games with family loyalty and financial manipulation, they'd learn that their daughter had inherited more than just their toxic house. I'd inherited their capacity for strategic thinking. I started documenting everything. Every conversation, every piece of evidence, every expert opinion. I researched legal precedents for fraudulent transfer and elder abuse statutes. I contacted victim advocacy groups and gathered resources about financial exploitation within families. But most importantly, I began crafting a plan that would expose their deception while ensuring they faced consequences for their actions. They'd taught me that blood meant nothing when money was involved. Now I would teach them that lesson worked both ways. The war they'd started with their gift was about to become their greatest regret. They thought they'd found the perfect victim in their heartbroken daughter. Instead, they'd created an opponent who understood them better than they understood themselves, who had nothing left to lose, and who was about to turn their own weapons against them with surgical precision. My transformation from victim to strategist began with a call to my cousin Rachel in Phoenix, someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year, but who worked as a forensic accountant for white-collar crime cases. Rachel had always been the family rebel, the one who called out my parents' subtle manipulations during holiday gatherings, while everyone else maintained polite silence. "Saren, what you're describing sounds like textbook fraudulent conveyance," Rachel said after I explained the situation. "They transferred a liability to you while concealing its true nature. In some states, that's criminal fraud, not just a civil matter." Rachel agreed to help me build a comprehensive case, but she warned me about the emotional cost. Family financial abuse cases are brutal because they involve people who know your vulnerabilities intimately. Are you prepared for them to use every emotional weapon they have against you? I thought about the respirator mask I now wore in my own home, the medical bills from mold exposure, the sleepless nights wondering how I'd ever dig out of this financial hole they'd created. I'm already living in the damage they caused. Bringing it into the light can't be worse than pretending it doesn't exist. Our first breakthrough came when Rachel discovered that my parents had taken out a home equity line of credit against the house 2 years before transferring it to me, funds they'd used for their Arizona retirement community down payment. The bank had required a property inspection for the loan, which meant they'd had professional documentation of the mold issues long before my gift. "This is huge," Rachel explained during one of our nightly strategy calls. "They borrowed against a property they knew was contaminated, used those funds for their own benefit, then transferred the worthless asset to you, along with the hidden debt obligation. That's fraud with a paper trail." Meanwhile, I was building a different kind of evidence through my own investigation. The contractor, Luis, had introduced me to other professionals who'd worked on the house, and their stories painted a picture of systematic deception. My parents had received multiple quotes for full remediation, understood exactly what they were dealing with, and had actively chosen concealment over honesty. But the most devastating ally came from an unexpected source. My Aunt Patricia, my mother's younger sister, who called me out of the blue 3 weeks into my investigation. "Saren, honey, I need to tell you something that's been eating at me," Patricia said during what started as a casual check-in call. "Your mother has been bragging to the family about how clever they were with the house situation. She said they solved 2 problems at once, got rid of a financial burden, and helped you out of your divorce troubles." The casual cruelty of that statement took my breath away. They weren't just hiding their crime, they were celebrating it. "Patricia, I need you to understand something. That house is contaminated with toxic mold. They didn't help me, they poisoned me and stuck me with a 6-figure cleanup bill they'd been avoiding for years." The silence on Patricia's end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaking with rage. "Those bastards. Saren, your mother specifically told me they'd had the house thoroughly cleaned and updated before giving it to you. She said it was in perfect condition." Patricia became my inside source for family communications. She started documenting conversations, saving text messages, and gathering evidence of how my parents were spinning the narrative to other relatives. The picture that emerged was of 2 people who genuinely believed they'd pulled off the perfect crime, unloading a toxic asset while maintaining their reputation as loving, generous parents. The evidence reached a tipping point when Patricia forwarded me a voice message my mother had left her the previous week. "We're just so proud of ourselves for finding a solution that worked for everyone. Saren gets a house, we get to retire worry-free, and she's young enough to handle whatever maintenance issues might come up. It's really the perfect arrangement." Whatever maintenance issues might come up, they knew. They absolutely knew. Armed with Rachel's financial analysis and Patricia's insider intelligence, I retained a lawyer specializing in elder fraud and family financial abuse. Margaret Yates was a sharp woman in her 50s who'd built her practice around cases like mine, adult children victimized by parents who used family bonds as weapons. "Your case is stronger than most because of the documentation and the clear timeline," Margaret explained during our first consultation. But I need you to understand that pursuing this will likely destroy your relationship with your parents permanently. Family fraud cases rarely end in reconciliation. I looked around her office thinking about the contaminated house I could barely afford to live in, the medical bills accumulating from mold exposure, the years of debt stretching ahead of me because of their calculated deception. Margaret, they destroyed our relationship the moment they decided to poison me for their financial benefit. I'm just making sure everyone knows what really happened. The legal strategy was multi-pronged. We'd file both civil and criminal complaints, seek restitution for remediation costs and medical expenses, and pursue additional damages for fraud and emotional distress. But beyond the legal action, I was planning something that would hurt them where they were most vulnerable: their carefully maintained reputation within our extended family and their retirement community. Because I'd learned something important during those weeks of investigation, my parents' greatest fear wasn't financial consequences. It was being exposed as the kind of people who would knowingly poison their own daughter for money. Their entire identity was built around being seen as loving, generous parents who'd sacrificed for their family. That image was about to become their most expensive liability. They'd taught me that family loyalty was transactional. Now I was going to show them exactly what that transaction had cost them, and what they owed in return. The war was escalating, my allies were in position, and my parents had no idea that their perfect crime was about to become their perfect nightmare. They'd underestimated their victim, overestimated their cleverness, and forgotten that the daughter they'd raised had learned strategy from watching them manipulate others for years. The reckoning was coming, and unlike their poisonous gift, it would be delivered with complete transparency about exactly what it would cost them. The confrontation I orchestrated wasn't the screaming match my parents expected. It was a carefully choreographed exposure designed to strip away every lie they'd built their retirement on. I chose Thanksgiving weekend, when they'd invited the entire extended family to their Arizona retirement community for what they were calling a gratitude celebration. I arrived with a folder of evidence, a portable air quality monitor, and Rachel by my side as my witness. My parents greeted me with the kind of performative warmth they'd perfected over the years, hugging me while Patricia watched from across the room with knowing eyes. "Saren, we're so glad you could make it," my mother gushed, her voice carrying that familiar note of artificial sweetness. "How are you enjoying the house? We just knew you'd love having your own space again." "Actually, Mom, I wanted to talk to everyone about the house," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I think the family should know exactly what kind of gift you gave me." The temperature in the room shifted as relatives sensed incoming drama. My father's face went pale and my mother's smile became rigid and desperate. "Honey, maybe we should discuss this privately," she said, already moving toward the kitchen. "No, I think everyone should hear this, since you've been telling them all about your generous gift." I opened my folder and pulled out the mold inspector's report. "Did you tell them that the house you gifted me is contaminated with toxic black mold? Or that you've known about it for over 3 years?" Uncle David, my father's brother, leaned forward. "What's she talking about, Rick?" My father's face cycled through confusion, anger, and finally resignation as he realized I had evidence. "Saren, you're being dramatic. Every old house has moisture issues. Stop." My voice cut through his deflection like a blade. "Just stop lying. I have the contractor records the insurance claims you filed, and lost the emails where you discussed disposal methods for the contaminated property. I have voice messages where Mom brags about solving your financial problem by sticking me with it." I pulled out my phone and played the recording. Patricia had forwarded my mother's voice, filling the shocked silence. "We're just so proud of ourselves for finding a solution that worked for everyone. Saren gets a house we get to retire worry-free, and she's young enough to handle whatever maintenance issues might come up." Cousin Mark, who'd always looked up to my parents, stood abruptly. "Are you seriously telling us you gave Saren a house you knew was contaminated? What kind of parents do that to their own daughter?" "You don't understand," my mother said, her voice becoming shrill. "We couldn't afford the remediation. We would have lost everything. She's young, she can rebuild, so you decided to poison me instead." I held up my medical records. "I've been sick for months because of your toxic gift. I'm wearing a respirator mask in my own home. You gave me your financial burden and called it love." Patricia stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. Janet, you told me that house was in perfect condition. You said you'd updated everything for Saren. You've been lying to the entire family. The room erupted in shocked conversations as relatives processed what they were hearing. My grandparents, my father's elderly parents who'd always praised their son's generosity, looked devastated. Aunt Sarah demanded to see the inspection report, her voice shaking with disbelief. But the final blow came when I pulled out the legal documents Margaret had prepared. I'm not here for an apology or family therapy. I'm here to serve you with notice that I'm filing both civil and criminal charges for fraudulent conveyance, elder abuse, and environmental endangerment. The district attorney's office in Portland is very interested in your case. My father's face went ashen. Criminal charges. Saren, we're your parents. Parents don't knowingly poison their children for money, I said, my voice unwavering. You're not parents anymore. You're criminals who happen to share my DNA. The evidence I presented was overwhelming and undeniable. The contractor quotes proving they knew about remediation costs. The insurance correspondence showing repeated water damage claims. The real estate consultation calling the house a negative value property. The financial records showing they'd borrowed against the house while knowing it was contaminated. Uncle David, who'd always been the family's voice of reason, looked at his brother with disgust. Rick, how could you do this? She's your daughter. You basically stole from her while pretending to help her. We gave her a house worth $400,000, my mother protested, but her voice lacked conviction. You gave her a house with negative equity due to contamination you knew about and hid, Rachel interjected, speaking for the first time. In forensic accounting terms, that's not a gift, it's financial fraud with family manipulation elements. The confrontation lasted 3 hours, with relatives demanding explanations, my parents offering increasingly desperate justifications, and me methodically destroying every lie they'd constructed. By the end, half the family had left in disgust, my grandparents were crying, and my parents sat in stunned silence as the full scope of their exposure became clear. The criminal complaint had already been filed. The civil lawsuit would freeze their assets pending resolution. Their retirement community neighbors who'd been invited to witness their family gratitude celebration now knew exactly what kind of people they were. Their carefully constructed image as loving parents had been destroyed in front of everyone who mattered to them. As I prepared to leave, my mother made one final attempt at manipulation. How can you destroy your own family over money? After everything we've done for you, I stopped at the door and looked back at the 2 people who'd raised me, who'd taught me about love and loyalty, who'd held me when I cried and celebrated my successes, and who'd ultimately been willing to poison me to solve their financial problems. You destroyed our family when you decided my health was worth less than your retirement fund. I'm just making sure everyone knows what you really are. I held up the air quality monitor which had been running during our entire confrontation. By the way, this has been documenting the indoor air quality here all afternoon. Your new home is clean, unlike the toxic waste dump you stuck me with while calling it love. The last thing I heard as I walked away was my grandmother asking my father how he could have been so cruel to his own daughter. The reckoning had finally arrived, and unlike their poisonous gift, it came with complete transparency about exactly what it would cost them. The week following the Thanksgiving confrontation brought consequences that cascaded through my parents' lives with the precision of falling dominoes. Margaret had warned me that family fraud cases often triggered broader investigations, but I hadn't anticipated how thoroughly their deception would unravel once exposed to legal scrutiny. The criminal investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Detective Lisa Morgan from the Portland Fraud Unit called me on Monday with news that made my vindication feel surreal. Miss Blackwood, your parents' case has triggered a broader investigation. We've discovered they've been running similar schemes with other properties in their investment portfolio. It turned out that my toxic house wasn't an isolated incident. My parents had been buying distressed properties, concealing major defects, and flipping them to unsuspecting buyers for years. The mold house had been their practice run for a much larger fraud operation that had victimized at least 6 other families across Oregon and Arizona. Your case broke this open because you had the resources and evidence to fight back, Detective Morgan explained. Most victims in these family fraud situations don't pursue criminal charges, which is exactly what perpetrators count on. Your willingness to prosecute your own parents has given us leverage to pursue the entire scheme. The media attention was immediate and devastating to my parents' reputation. Local retirees accused of poisoning daughter in property fraud scheme ran across Portland news outlets by Wednesday. Their retirement community, Heritage Oaks, began its own investigation when neighbors started asking questions about how the Blackwoods could afford their premium villa on a teacher and accountant's retirement income. Patricia called me daily with updates from the family chaos. Your father's been trying to reach every relative, claiming you've been brainwashed by lawyers and that the mold situation isn't that serious, she reported. But Grandma Rose isn't buying it. She told him she's ashamed to call him her son. The most satisfying collapse came from their Arizona social circle. The retirement community where they'd positioned themselves as successful, generous grandparents became a source of intense scrutiny and embarrassment. When photos of my contaminated house appeared in news reports alongside the inspection documentation, their neighbors began questioning everything they'd been told about the Blackwood family success story. Margaret filed for an emergency injunction to freeze their assets pending criminal trial, which meant they couldn't access the funds they'd obtained through fraudulent property transactions. Within 10 days of my Thanksgiving revelation, they'd gone from comfortable retirees to criminal defendants facing potential prison time and financial ruin. But the personal fallout cut deeper than legal consequences. My Uncle David called to apologize and inform me that he was cutting all contact with my parents. I can't pretend to have a relationship with people who would poison their own daughter for money, he said. What they did to you could have killed you. That's not family, that's predatory behavior. The family schism was complete and irreversible. My grandparents, devastated by their son's actions, established a fund to help with my medical expenses, as their way of trying to restore some family honor. Cousins who'd grown up looking to my parents as role models publicly distanced themselves from the scandal. Holiday gatherings were canceled indefinitely, as no one wanted to navigate the toxic dynamics my revelation had created. My parents' attempts to contact me became increasingly desperate and manipulative. Text messages ranged from fake medical emergencies to threats about destroying the family forever. My mother left voicemails sobbing about how I was killing her with stress, while my father sent emails trying to negotiate a family settlement that would avoid criminal prosecution. I saved every message as evidence and responded to none of them. Margaret had been clear that any direct communication could be used to claim I was willing to reconcile, potentially weakening the criminal case. But more importantly, I'd recognized these manipulation tactics from my marriage to Marcus, the same cycles of fake crisis, emotional blackmail, and attempted negotiation that abusers use when their victims stop playing along. Rachel flew to Portland to help me navigate the media attention and legal proceedings. You're handling this better than most people handle normal divorces, she observed during one of our evidence review sessions. But I'm worried about the long-term emotional impact. You've essentially orphaned yourself to pursue justice. The question haunted me during those surreal weeks of watching my parents' lives disintegrate in real time. Had I gone too far? Was destroying their entire existence proportionate to what they'd done to me? The doubt crept in during quiet moments, usually late at night when I was alone in my contaminated house wearing a respirator mask, wondering if family bonds should have meant more than financial justice. But then I'd remember the voice message where my mother bragged about their perfect solution. The contractor quotes proving they'd known exactly what they were condemning me to. The casual way they'd discussed my health as an acceptable sacrifice for their retirement comfort. The systematic nature of their broader fraud scheme that had hurt other families. They hadn't made a mistake or a desperate decision in a moment of crisis. They'd planned, executed, and celebrated a scheme to transfer their financial problems to their vulnerable daughter, while positioning themselves as generous benefactors. The cruelty was calculated, not accidental. By the time criminal charges were formally filed, my parents had lost their social circle, their family relationships, their financial security, and their freedom pending trial. Their retirement dreams had become a nightmare of legal fees, public humiliation, and the prospect of prison time. The collapse was total systematic and entirely self-inflicted. They'd taught me that family loyalty was conditional and transactional. Now, they were learning that lesson applied in both directions, and their daughter had become a much better strategist than they'd ever imagined. Justice wasn't just being served, it was being delivered with the same calculated precision they'd used to destroy my life, except I was doing it with complete transparency about exactly what their crimes had cost them. 6 months after that devastating Thanksgiving confrontation, I stood in the kitchen of my fully remediated home, breathing freely, without a respirator mask, for the first time in over a year. The criminal trial had concluded, with my parents accepting a plea deal that included 5 years probation, full restitution for my medical expenses and remediation costs, and victim impact statements that would follow them through any future test. Financial dealings. The house that had been their weapon of financial destruction had become my symbol of survival and transformation. Using the restitution funds and a victim compensation grant, I'd not only completed the mold remediation, but had renovated the entire space to create something that was truly mine, not an inheritance or gift with hidden strings, but a home earned through my own resilience and unwillingness to accept victimization. Margaret called with the final legal update on a crisp spring morning. The civil settlement is finalized. They're paying the maximum allowed under Oregon fraud statutes plus your legal fees. More importantly, their guilty plea means this conviction will show up in background checks for any future financial activities. They can't do this to other families. The financial justice felt significant, but the emotional healing had required different work entirely. Through therapy, I'd learned to distinguish between mourning the parents I thought I had and accepting the reality of who they actually were. Dr. Sarah Chen, my therapist, helped me understand that grieving the loss of parents while they're still alive is a unique form of trauma that requires redefining concepts of family entirely. You've essentially had to construct a new understanding of trust and loyalty from scratch, Dr. Chen explained during one of our sessions. The people who were supposed to be your ultimate safety net tried to poison you for money. Recovering from that level of betrayal takes tremendous psychological work. But the most meaningful healing came from the chosen family that emerged from the wreckage of my biological one. Patricia had become the maternal figure I'd always needed, but never recognized was missing someone who prioritized my well-being over maintaining family peace. Rachel's forensic skills had not only saved me legally, but had taught me that intelligence and strategy could be used for protection rather than manipulation. The broader family members who'd witnessed that Thanksgiving confrontation had formed their own support network around me. Uncle David organized a real family dinner the following holiday season, explicitly excluding my parents, but including everyone who'd chosen emotional honesty over enabling toxic behavior. For the first time in my adult life, I'd experienced what healthy family dynamics actually looked like. My relationship with my grandparents had deepened in unexpected ways. Grandma Rose, approaching 90, told me during one of our weekly phone calls, "Honey, I raised your father to be better than this. His choices aren't your fault or your responsibility to fix. I'm proud of you for refusing to accept being treated as disposable." The professional vindication exceeded anything I'd hoped for. Detective Morgan informed me that my case had become a model for prosecuting family financial fraud with other jurisdictions, using our evidence-gathering methods and legal strategies. Your willingness to pursue criminal charges against your own parents has changed how we handle these cases, she said. Most victims protect their abusers. You protected future victims instead. 3 months after the trial concluded, I received a letter from a woman in Seattle whose parents had attempted a similar property fraud scheme. She'd found my case through news reports and used my legal strategies to pursue her own justice. "Reading about your case gave me permission to stop protecting people who were destroying me," she wrote. "Thank you for showing me that family loyalty isn't supposed to be one-sided." The toxic house had been transformed not just physically but symbolically. I'd converted the basement where the mold had flourished into a bright office space where I now worked as a victim advocate, helping other people navigate family financial fraud cases. The irony wasn't lost on me. The space they'd used to poison me had become the foundation for helping other people escape similar poisoning. My dating life had also transformed through this experience. The manipulation tactics that had worked on the heartbroken woman who'd accepted their gift were useless against someone who'd learned to recognize calculated deception. I'd recently started seeing James, the mold inspector who'd first revealed the truth about my house. Our relationship was built on the kind of radical honesty that becomes possible when you've stopped tolerating lies in any form. "You know what's interesting," James observed during one of our evening walks through the neighborhood. "That house is probably healthier now than most homes in Portland. You didn't just remediate the mold, you eliminated every source of toxicity, including the people who brought it into your life." As I reflected on the year that had transformed my understanding of family loyalty and justice, the lessons felt both painful and empowering. I'd learned that blood relationships don't automatically deserve protection when they become predatory. That pursuing justice against family members isn't betrayal, it's refusing to enable abuse. That the people who truly love you will support your healing rather than demand you protect your abusers. My parents had taught me their final lesson without meaning to that chosen family based on mutual respect and genuine care is infinitely more valuable than biological family that treats you as expendable. They'd thought they were disposing of their financial problems by transferring them to their vulnerable daughter. Instead, they'd created an opponent who understood them better than they understood themselves, and who was willing to pursue justice regardless of social pressure to keep family business private. The woman who'd gratefully accepted a poisonous gift while calling it love was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real love doesn't come with hidden costs or calculated cruelty. I'd learned to distinguish between manipulation disguised as generosity and authentic support that asks nothing in return. Standing in my fully remediated kitchen, breathing freely in a home that was finally truly mine, I understood that sometimes the greatest gift parents can give their children is teaching them what they refuse to accept in any relationship, even if they have to learn that lesson by watching their parents face the consequences of their own toxic choices. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own survival? What would you do if the people who raised you tried to sacrifice your health for their financial benefit? I learned that sometimes protecting yourself means refusing to protect the people who hurt you, even when they're family. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on when family bonds become toxic bonds. I read every single response because these conversations matter. If this story resonated with you or you know someone who needs to hear it, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about choosing yourself over dysfunction. Share this video with anyone who might need permission to stop protecting people who are harming them. Thank you for listening to my family revenge story and for supporting others who are learning that they deserve better than toxic love disguised as family loyalty. Remember, real family lifts you up, it doesn't poison you for profit.